Picture this. You wake up freezing. You haven't eaten in 2 days. The only weapon you have is a sharpened stone tied to a stick, and you need to kill something the size of a bison to survive. This was life for Neanderthals, a species of human built not for comfort but for endurance. They built fires in blizzards, hunted giants, cared for their wounded, and when they vanished, they left behind no words, only bones and questions. So today we follow their trail, carved into stone and buried beneath time. Before we talk about how Neanderthals lived, we have to understand where they lived, because this wasn't a gentle earth. The world they inherited was cold, dry, and dangerous, a place where survival was a daily negotiation with nature. They emerged around 130,000 years ago, during one of the most volatile chapters in the planet's climate history. Ice ages rolled in like waves, freezing Europe and much of Asia beneath miles of glacial ice. When the ice pulled back, brief thaws turned the land into floodplains, wind-blasted steppes, and muddy expanses scattered with boulders the size of houses. The ground was often frozen, forests were sparse. Even when trees existed, they were twisted and stunted by cold. Wood, when found, was a precious material, used for fire, tools, or building the bare minimum of shelter. Temperatures during glacial peaks could drop below -30 degrees Celsius. Snow could blanket the ground for months. The wind stripped heat from the body like a blade. The sun, even at its highest, barely warmed the air. What did grow in this world was harsh: moss, lichen, scrubby shrubs, grasslands stretched for miles, but most of what grew there couldn't be eaten. Berries were rare. Roots had to be dug from frozen ground. You couldn't survive by foraging. You had to hunt, and not just for protein. You needed fat. In this climate, fat was fuel. Without it, your body would burn muscle just to keep your core temperature from dropping. To make matters worse, the herds moved. Mammoths, bison, wild horses, they didn't stay put. They followed the seasons, which meant the Neanderthals had to follow them. Migration wasn't a choice. It was a cycle. You moved or you starved. Water wasn't always easy either. Rivers froze, rain turned to sleet, springs vanished under ice, and when water did appear, from melting snow or shallow streams, it had to be consumed quickly before it froze again or turned brackish with rot. In this world, time didn't heal. It eroded. It wore down everything: bone, shelter, even memory. This is the environment Neanderthals were born into. Neanderthals didn't just survive in the cold. They were biologically shaped by it in every detail. Their bodies evolved over thousands of years to handle a world that punished the unprepared. On average, they stood about 5'5", weighed up to 175 pounds, and were densely built. Their frames were compact and powerful: wide hips, thick rib cages, short limbs. Everything about them conserved heat and maximized brute strength. They didn't look like us, and they weren't supposed to. Their bones were heavier, their joints reinforced, their muscles naturally thicker. They didn't work out. They didn't train. They were born strong, with biology tuned for endurance, lifting, dragging, climbing, and butchering. Inside, the differences ran deeper. Their lungs were likely larger, their noses longer and wider, adapted to warm, freezing air before it reached the lungs. Their skin was probably pale to absorb more sunlight. They also had more brown fat, the kind that burns energy to keep the body warm. But it wasn't just about strength. Neanderthals had large eyes and expanded visual centers in the brain, optimized for spotting movement in low light. This gave them an edge in forests, caves, or twilight hunts. They could see better in the dark than we can today. Their brains were even slightly larger than ours, but that didn't mean they were smarter. Much of that extra volume was likely used for vision and motor control, not abstract thinking. They were highly specialized, not generalists like Homo sapiens. Genetic evidence also shows higher natural levels of creatine, a compound that boosts muscle performance. That means they didn't just look strong, they were strong. But strength came at a cost. Bigger bodies burn more calories. More muscle means more food, more fat, more hunting. In lean seasons, their physical design became a liability. Their survival depended not just on strength, but on consistently feeding it. In the most brutal parts of the Ice Age, exposure could kill within hours. Wind, snow, and plunging temperatures made sleeping in the open nearly impossible. So, Neanderthals found protection wherever they could: cliffsides, rock overhangs, and especially caves. But caves weren't the cozy havens we often imagine. They were damp, dark, and crowded. Smoke from fires clung to the ceilings. The floor was cold year-round, sometimes frozen. Mold grew on the walls, rainwater seeped in, and caves attracted predators just as much as people. Wolves, hyenas, even bears would sometimes follow the scent of blood or meat straight into the entrance. In some cases, they didn't just scavenge, they slaughtered entire groups in their sleep. Over time, Neanderthals began building their own shelters. Simple, but effective. They used whatever materials the land gave them: mammoth bones, large tusks, wooden branches, stone slabs. These structures were often dome-like frames covered in hides and held down with heavy rocks. The inside was lined with dry grass, moss, or furs to insulate against the ground. These homes weren't permanent. They were temporary outposts built to follow the hunt. When game moved, the shelters were abandoned, often layered over by new ones decades or centuries later. In some archaeological sites, we find multiple generations of life stacked like pages in a book. Fire pits, tools, bones, each layer telling the story of a group passing through, surviving another season. Inside, space was functional. Fire sat at the center, shielded by rocks or bones. Cooking happened directly on the coals. Bones and scraps were tossed away from the shelter to avoid attracting scavengers, though that didn't always work. Flint chips littered the corners. Sometimes bits of ochre or personal ornaments were found. Colored stones, pierced animal teeth, evidence that even here, in a world of constant survival, they still tried to mark their space, to make it a little more human. These homes were not places of comfort. They were shields, thin barriers between life and death. But they allowed Neanderthals to stay warm, to regroup, to rest. And in a landscape with no guarantees, that was enough. Shelter kept them alive at night, but during the day, everything revolved around food. Neanderthals couldn't stockpile supplies. They had no pottery, no salt, no reliable way to preserve meat. What they killed had to be eaten quickly, before the cold hardened it, before bacteria set in, before the scent drew predators from miles away. They went after massive prey: woolly mammoths, rhinoceroses, aurochs, bison, wild horses, animals that could crush a human in seconds. These weren't long-distance ambushes. Neanderthals had no bows. Their primary weapon was the thrusting spear, used up close, face to face. Kills often came down to coordination, courage, and luck. Sometimes they used terrain to their advantage: cliffs, ravines, swamps. They'd chase animals into traps or dead ends, then close in for the final strike. But most of the time, it was direct confrontation, the kind of hunt where injury was almost guaranteed. And the reward wasn't just meat. They needed fat, thick, calorie-dense, slow-burning fat. In the Ice Age, fat was fuel. Without it, their bodies couldn't maintain heat, couldn't recover from injury, couldn't survive the winter. That's why brains, marrow, and organs were highly prized. Sometimes these were eaten on the spot, raw and still steaming. Nothing went to waste. Bones were smashed open for marrow. Tendons became string. Hides were scraped clean and dried for clothing or shelter. Even hooves could be boiled for glue. Everything had a purpose, because everything had a cost. When food was scarce, desperation followed quickly. Herds moved, weather shifted. One failed hunt could mean days of hunger. In those moments, the line between human and animal blurred. There's evidence, in some sites, of cannibalism: human bones with cut marks, burned femurs cracked for marrow. It wasn't ritual. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. When the group had nothing else, they turned to the only resource left: each other. These choices weren't made lightly. But in a world where every day was a question of energy in versus energy out, they were sometimes the only option. Food wasn't just about hunger, it was about time, tools, teamwork, and risk. To eat, Neanderthals had to master the land, predict animal behavior, and face death regularly. And once they ate, they had to do it all again tomorrow. You couldn't survive in the Ice Age with your bare hands, and Neanderthals didn't try to. Their tools weren't just primitive rocks. They were crafted with precision, shaped for specific tasks, and improved over generations. Every chipped flint, every sharpened edge represented hard-earned knowledge passed down by firelight. The most iconic tool was the hand axe, a palm-sized, almond-shaped stone used for cutting meat, shaping wood, and breaking bone. But as time went on, their toolkit expanded. They crafted scrapers to clean hides, burins for engraving, awls for piercing, and points designed specifically for thrusting spears. Flint was the material of choice, tough, brittle, and capable of splitting into razor-sharp edges. But flint wasn't everywhere. Some groups traveled for miles to find it, or traded across distances, leaving behind clues of long-forgotten roots and relationships. Attaching these stone points to shafts took more than brute strength. It required resin, sinew, binding fibers, and careful shaping. Heat treating, grinding, hafting, these were complex processes, not mindless smashing. Each tool took time. Each one mattered. Neanderthals didn't have bone needles early on, but later evidence shows they learned to pierce and stitch with surprising sophistication. Hides were turned into clothing, fitted to the body, layered for warmth. Tools weren't just about killing. They were about enduring, staying warm, staying mobile, staying alive. Fire, too, was a tool, and one of their greatest. It wasn't just warmth. It was light in the darkness, protection against animals, and a way to cook food that might otherwise sicken or kill. But fire didn't come easy. They had no matches. They likely used flint and pyrite to spark flame, a delicate skill that took patience and dry material. In wet, windy conditions, failure meant freezing. Their shelters, their clothes, their weapons, their fires, all of it was tied to tool use. Neanderthals were physical beings, yes, but they were also engineers, craftsmen, and problem solvers, and the better their tools became, the longer they could last in a world that gave them nothing for free. Every tool they made, every hunt they attempted, every step they took carried risk. Injury wasn't an exception in Neanderthal life. It was a constant. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal skeletons riddled with fractures, ribs, arms, skulls, legs, many of which had clearly healed. These weren't minor cuts or bruises. They were signs of trauma from a life lived in close contact with danger. Hunting with thrusting spears meant being within striking distance of animals that outweighed them by 1,000 pounds. One slip, one wrong angle, and the hunter became the hunted. Kicks from a horse, a mammoth's tusk, a fall on icy rock, a collapsing shelter, a rock slide. Even a shallow cut could be deadly if it became infected. And yet, the evidence tells us many of these injuries healed. That means they weren't abandoned. Someone brought them food. Someone kept the fire going. Someone made sure they lived long enough to recover. Some Neanderthals had permanent disabilities, fused joints, crushed limbs, malformed bones from injury or disease. And still, they lived into their 40s. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a group refuses to let its weakest members die. They didn't have modern medicine, but they had ingenuity. Ash may have been used as an antiseptic. Animal fat helped seal wounds. Moss acted as padding or bandages. Sharp flint could cut away rot or infection. Some herbs may have numbed pain or reduced inflammation, even if they didn't know why they worked. There's even evidence of amputations, not just traumatic loss, but surgical removal followed by healing. That means bleeding was stopped, infection was somehow prevented, and the person survived. Still, recovery didn't mean relief. Arthritis was common. Tooth infections were brutal, malnutrition stunted growth, and fatigue, the kind that settles into the bones, was a fact of life. Pain wasn't something they escaped, it was something they carried. Every scar told a story of risk, endurance, and resilience, and of the people who stood by them when it would have been easier to walk away. No one survived the Ice Age alone. Not even the strongest Neanderthal could have done it without others. Everything about their world demanded cooperation, from hunting massive prey, to building shelters, to nursing each other back from injury. And the fossil record proves they did exactly that. Some of the most powerful evidence of Neanderthal group dynamics comes not from their tools, but from their bones. Skeletons with shattered limbs, missing teeth, or fused joints. Individuals who would have needed help to eat, move, and survive, yet lived for years. This only happens when someone else steps in. These weren't acts of convenience. They were commitments, daily, difficult, and deliberate. Care wasn't limited to the injured. Children needed years of guidance before they could contribute. Elders passed down knowledge, stories, skills. Women and men alike hunted, gathered, and made tools. Roles weren't rigid because survival didn't care about categories. What mattered was the contribution. Neanderthal groups were small, usually 10 to 30 individuals. That meant every person counted. When one was lost, the whole group was weakened. So they protected each other not just out of compassion, but because their survival depended on it. They likely used a mix of sounds, hand gestures, and instinctive cues to communicate. Their vocal anatomy suggests the capacity for speech, maybe not with the same nuance as modern humans, but enough to organize, warn, and teach. And they taught constantly. Children watched, mimicked, and gradually took on tasks. Flint knapping, fire making, butchering, none of it was intuitive. It took time, patience, repetition, and someone willing to guide a younger mind through the steps. Even their burial practices hint at social bonds. In multiple caves, Neanderthal remains have been found in deliberately arranged positions, sometimes dusted with ochre or placed with objects. It wasn't always elaborate, but it suggests memory, grief, the idea that someone's existence didn't end the moment their body stopped moving. They may not have had language like ours, but they had loyalty, they had memory, and they had the will to keep their weakest alive. Because in the Ice Age, survival wasn't about being the strongest. It was about who had someone watching their back. For Neanderthals, death wasn't rare. It was part of the landscape. Few made it past their 30s. Many died younger, from injury, illness, starvation, or exposure. Children were the most vulnerable. The smallest infection, a broken bone, a mother's lost milk, any of it could end a life before it truly began. Predators were everywhere. Cave lions, dire wolves, hyenas, bears, all capable of killing an adult human. One misstep outside the shelter could be fatal. Bones bearing claw marks and bite wounds show just how often Neanderthals became prey. But death didn't always come with violence. Disease was constant. Infections, food poisoning, hypothermia, and chronic fatigue wore down even the strongest bodies. Simple cuts turned septic. Rotten teeth led to lethal abscesses. Cold weather caused frostbite and respiratory failure, and once illness spread through a small group in a confined shelter, there was nowhere to hide. Evidence also points to moments of desperation. In some sites, archaeologists have found human bones with the same cut marks seen on butchered animals, scraped clean of meat, cracked open for marrow, and burned in fires. Cannibalism, not ritual, not warfare, just survival when nothing else remained. And yet, even in this grim reality, there are signs of care in death. Some Neanderthals buried their dead. Not all and not always, but enough to matter. Bodies placed in shallow graves, ochre sprinkled over bones, items left nearby. We don't know why. Maybe it was grief, maybe protection from scavengers, maybe belief in something more. But it shows they remembered. They didn't just survive until they dropped. They noticed when someone was gone. For them, death wasn't dramatic. It was expected, a presence in every decision, a weight in every silence. And when it came, which it always did, it left behind more than bones. It left a gap in a group where every member mattered. For thousands of years, Neanderthals weren't alone. Another species walked the earth with them, Homo sapiens. Modern humans began spreading into Europe and Western Asia around 45,000 years ago. In places like the Levant and the Balkans, their paths overlapped. Sometimes they lived near each other, sometimes in neighboring caves, sometimes in the same one, separated by layers of time. At first, it wasn't clear how they interacted, but over time, the evidence began to speak. Tools from both species have been found in the same layers. This suggests contact and likely exchange. Homo sapiens may have learned from Neanderthal stoneworking techniques. Neanderthals may have adopted beads, ochre, and new ways of shaping tools. They didn't just share space, they shared blood. Genetic studies prove that interbreeding occurred. Today, almost every non-African human carries 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. It wasn't just contact, it was reproduction. But that legacy is small. Some Neanderthal genes were quickly selected out over time, especially those linked to reproduction and brain development. Incompatibility may have played a role. Interbreeding happened, but it was rare. and probably fraught. Some researchers believe not all encounters were peaceful. There's little evidence of blended settlements or long-term cultural fusion, and Neanderthal Y chromosomes are almost entirely absent from modern human genomes, suggesting that male Neanderthals may have been excluded or their offspring didn't survive. This paints a picture of imbalance. One species arriving with greater numbers, more flexible technology, more social cohesion. The other already stretched thin, struggling to adapt. It wasn't a war, it was pressure, silent, unrelenting, a slow displacement by a population better suited to change. In the end, they didn't vanish all at once. They were absorbed, pushed back, outlasted, and in some rare cases, remembered.